I worked the factory floor for 40 years. Never missed a shift, never asked for more than a fair shot. My father built that place with his bare hands after the war. My brother Richard inherited it, and me, I kept it running quietly, faithfully through every recession, every storm. But the day I asked to buy the plant, they laughed. My own brother, my own parents, they said I was just a worker, that I had no vision, that I didn't understand business. And the next morning they fired me, locked me out of the gates like I was nobody. I sat in my car that night with oil on my hands and tears in my eyes. 3 years later, Richard came back, broke, desperate, asking for a job. He now works night shift. On the factory floor I own, you ever have your own family look straight through you like you didn't exist? Let me tell you what I did next, and how I turned that pain into power. My name is Susan Kowalski. I'm 62 years old and I've spent most of my life inside a factory just outside Detroit. The smell of metal, the rhythm of machines, the weight of grease on my skin. Those things aren't just familiar. They're part of me. My father, Wilhelm Kowalski, came to America after World War II with nothing but a pair of boots and a pocket full of tools. He started a small auto parts plant, 10 men, 1 lathe, and a dream bigger than himself. He raised us, me and my younger brother Richard, on stories of sacrifice and grit. But there was always a divide. My father saw Richard as the future. He was the one who talked about expansion, marketing, growth. And me, I was the one who fixed broken gearboxes and recalibrated machines at 2 in the morning. I made sure shipments went out on time. But in his eyes, and later my mother's, I was just the support beam. Strong, reliable, but not meant to lead. Even when I was a teenager covered in grime, I remember my mother whispering, "Susan's a hard worker, but she's not built for business." It never made me angry. Not back then. I thought if I just kept working, kept showing up, they'd see me after my father passed. Richard took over the company I stayed on as the floor manager. I didn't argue. I thought we were a team. For a while, things looked good. Richard wore the suits, I handled the machines. I taught new hires, fixed production gaps, covered for absentee workers. But slowly, I saw where we were heading. Richard had ideas, lots of them, big marketing plans. He hired consultants who had never stepped inside a factory. He laid off old workers and replaced them with efficiency experts who couldn't even operate a drill press. I brought up concerns. I begged him to slow down, to talk to the crew, to listen. He accused me of being stuck in the past. My mother defended him. He needs to take risks. "Susan, you just don't understand how business works these days." That stung more than I let on, because deep down, I knew she still saw me as the same grease-stained girl with no ambition. But I wasn't afraid of change. I was afraid of stupidity. I saw the cracks forming, equipment left unserviced, morale slipping, orders delayed because someone in a suit forgot how long machining actually takes. Then came the recession. Our biggest client cut their contracts, costs rose, paychecks shrank. I offered solutions, specialized parts, shorter custom runs, reaching out to agricultural supply chains. Richard brushed me off. "We don't downscale." He said, "We expand, we double down." He took out loans we couldn't afford, invested in automation systems no one was trained to use, and then when everything started to collapse, he blamed the workers. I'll never forget the day he said, "Maybe we just need to clean house and start fresh." 40 people, men and women I'd worked with for decades, became costs to be eliminated. I pleaded with him. I begged him not to fire Carlos, who'd lost 2 fingers working overtime, or Linda, who'd skipped her own chemo sessions to finish a rush order. He fired them anyway, and my parents. They called it necessary restructuring. I sat alone in the break room one night, staring at the old company photo hanging on the wall. We all looked so young, so proud. I wondered when exactly I'd stopped being part of the family business and just become a burden. They hadn't figured out how to let go of. The tipping point came on a Tuesday. Richard called an all-hands meeting. He stood at the front of the break room, arms crossed, trying to look composed, but his voice cracked when he spoke. "We're shutting down the plant by the end of the quarter," he said. "It's no longer sustainable." There were gasps. A few workers cursed under their breath. One man quietly took off his name badge and slipped it into his pocket. I stared at Richard, waiting for him to say something else. An offer of severance. a plan to sell assets, a hint of regret. Instead, he said, "There's a scrap company in Shanghai that's made a decent offer for the machines. We'll sell what we can. The rest will be dismantled." Dismantled. 40 years of labor, gone in a spreadsheet. When the meeting ended, I cornered him outside the office. "You're really going to sell this place for parts?" I asked. Richard didn't meet my eyes. "It's just metal, Susan? We need to move on?" "No," I said. "You need to take responsibility," he scoffed. "You don't understand what I'm dealing with, you never did. You've been down there turning bolts thinking that's the whole business." I felt my chest tighten. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From rage, from disappointment. "I've been the one keeping this place running," I said. "While you made speech after speech, I kept the lights on." He smiled like I'd told a joke. "You're a good worker, Susan, but that's all you are." That night I drove home in silence. No radio, no heat, just the sound of winter wind clawing at the windows. I sat in my driveway staring at the steering wheel, remembering the day my father handed me my first set of tools. I was 13, I'd just finished cleaning out the coolant trap on the old lathe, and he said, "You got hands like mine, girl." That's a good thing, but somehow that never translated to trust. I thought I had accepted that, until now. The next morning I called a meeting not with management but with the workers. I stood in the empty break room, unsure if anyone would even show up. Then Carlos walked in. Then Linda. Then more. I told them the truth. The plant was being sold. Jobs were disappearing. But I had an idea. "What if we buy the factory ourselves?" I said. Some laughed softly, not mockingly, more out of disbelief than ridicule. I told them I was willing to put up every dollar I had saved. I had the mechanical knowledge. Carlos had connections with buyers. Linda had managed logistics for years. "We know this business better than anyone," I said. "All we need is a chance." That afternoon, I approached Richard with a formal counteroffer, my savings plus a loan. I was in the process of securing from a community development fund. He looked at the papers, then laughed. "You're serious," he said. "Susan, this isn't a garage sale. You can't just scrape together a few bucks and buy a dying factory." "It's not dying," I said. "It's choking under your leadership." I wasn't trying to be cruel, I was being honest. He handed the papers back without even reading them. "Take care of yourself, Susan," he said. "You've worked hard. Maybe it's time to rest." Rest. As if I was an old piece of equipment ready for retirement. That night I sat in my kitchen staring at the stack of rejection emails from banks. Most didn't even bother to call. One simply said, "Not viable," but I wasn't alone. Carlos called, then Linda. Then Marvin the toolmaker who'd been there since the 80s. "We're still in," they told me. Even if it's just for pride, I looked around my tiny home. Scarred hands, aging face, exhausted spirit. But somewhere deep in me, something had lit up. Not anger, not revenge, conviction. If I couldn't make my family see me, then I'd build something so strong they couldn't ignore me anymore. A week passed, then 2. Richard moved fast. Machines were tagged for shipment. Inventory was liquidated. Old parts were tossed into dumpsters like junk mail. Our factory was being dismantled piece by piece, and I was still showing up every day. Not because I worked there anymore, but because I couldn't let go. I sat in the empty break room one morning, clutching a thermos of cold coffee, staring at the bulletin board. All the names, all the birthdays, all the handwritten shift notes from guys who had been here longer than I'd been alive. Carlos came in and sat across from me. He looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept since the news broke. "We still doing this?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't say anything else, just nodded back. That night I pulled every cent I had from my savings. The number looked small on paper, too small, but it was everything. Then I emptied my father's old lockbox, the one he left me in the will. Inside was a letter. He'd written it during his final year before the cancer made him too weak to stand. It said, "I know this plant will outlive me, maybe even outlive the family, but I hope you remember what it was built for. It wasn't for money, it was for people." I read that letter 5 times and then I got to work. I called the Community Investment Trust, applied for a cooperative development loan, pitched the idea of an employee-owned recovery plan. I didn't know all the jargon, but I knew how to show numbers that mattered: output, waste reduction, repair, turnaround time. The director, a woman named Marion, asked me one question. "Why you?" I took a deep breath and said, "Because I care more about the workers than I care about being right, and I've already lost everything else." She looked me in the eye for a long time, then said, "Let's try." I went back to Richard with a revised offer, more structured, backed by a loan approval letter. He didn't even read it. "I already have a buyer," he said, "for scrap. For what it's worth," he said flatly. "It's worth more than metal," I said. "You just don't see it." He stood up. "You're done here, Susan. You've been done. You just don't know how to stop." I waited for my mother to say something. She was sitting quietly on the other side of the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle. "You've worked hard your whole life," she said. "But some things just aren't meant to be. Maybe it's time to let go." I stared at her, then at Richard, then back at her, and for the first time I realized they were never going to believe in me. Not because I wasn't capable, but because they never saw me as more than background. That was the moment I broke, not in anger. In clarity, I stood up, tucked the papers back into my folder, and said, "The day you fire someone like Carlos without a second thought, you stop being a leader. You become a liability." Richard didn't reply. I turned to my mother. "You used to braid my hair when I came home from the factory. You called me your steel girl. What happened?" She looked away. I walked out of that office, out of the only home I'd ever known. And I didn't look back, because from that moment forward I wasn't trying to save a family legacy. I was building something of my own. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of old ledgers, a legal pad, and a calculator that still had grease smudges from the plant. I wasn't trying to build an empire. I was trying to build a lifeboat for myself, and for the people no one else would fight for. I made a list, 42 names. Every worker who'd been let go in the last wave. Next to each one, I wrote down what they did, how long they'd been there, what skills they had. I knew them all by heart. Carlos. Welding and maintenance. 32 years, Linda shipping and scheduling, breast cancer survivor. 27 years, Marvin toolmaker. Still using the same lathe my father brought over in 1964. By morning, I had a rough plan. We would form a cooperative. Not a hierarchy, not a new Kowalski empire, a real employee-owned business. Everyone would have a vote, everyone would own a share, everyone would work. I called Marion at the Community Investment Trust. Told her we were ready to move forward. She walked me through the process: nonprofit bylaws, shared governance structures, financial disclosures. It was overwhelming. I felt like a kid on the first day of school, but I took notes. I asked questions. I stayed up late reading about cooperatives, supply chain, partnerships, government grants, and I kept showing up. Carlos helped me build out the new floor plan. We restructured the space for lean manufacturing, smaller batches, higher quality, fewer defects. Linda ran logistics from my garage using a refurbished desktop and a folding table. Marvin repaired old machines on weekends. We traded tools for time, meals for help. Everyone brought what they had. We called it Kowalski Community Machining, not because we wanted to keep the family name, but because the people deserved to reclaim it. We weren't just saving a building. We were rebuilding a purpose. After 2 months, we had our first small contract. A local farm equipment supplier needed custom brackets in limited quantities. Big companies turned them down. We didn't. We got the specs. Ran prototypes, delivered early. Then came the second contract. Then the third word got around. We were small, but we didn't miss deadlines. We didn't cut corners, and we didn't treat people like numbers. For the first time in years, I saw men and women walk into work with their heads high. We painted the old walls, fixed the broken bathroom heater, added a shared meal table in the break room. Someone brought in a radio. Someone else brought in their kid's drawing of the factory and taped it on the door. We weren't a miracle. We were a machine reassembled by hand, piece by piece. Then one morning I opened an email from a regional supplier based in Ohio. They wanted a site visit. Potential long-term partnership. Large scale. I showed it to Carlos. He just smiled and said, "Told you this would work." But the best moment wasn't the email. It was when I saw Linda laughing in the lunchroom sharing photos of her grandson, when Marvin started mentoring a 20-year-old apprentice, when Carlos walked in with a fresh uniform, proud of the patch on his chest. That's when I knew we weren't trying to compete with the world. We were just proving to ourselves that we mattered, that people like us, people who'd been thrown out, written off, underestimated, could still build something worth walking into each morning, and no one could take that away from us again. 3 years passed. Kowalski Community. Machining was no longer a question mark. We were a proven name, small, specialized, and solid. We had consistent contracts. Our backlog was 3 months out. Every worker had full health coverage, paid leave, a vote. A stake. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. And then one gray November morning I walked into the front office and saw something I never expected. Richard. He was sitting in the waiting area, hair thinner, shoulders hunched, a beat-up briefcase at his feet. He stood up when he saw me, eyes uncertain. "Hey, Susan," he said. "Do you have a minute?" I didn't answer right away. The room was quiet. The receptionist had stepped away. All I could hear was the clock ticking and the distant hum of machines from the shop floor. I finally said, "You're early? We don't open interviews until 9?" He forced a smile. "I'm not here for an interview, I was hoping we could talk." I motioned him into the office, closed the door behind us. He sat across from me, nervously tapping his fingers against the armrest. I lost everything he said. The buyer who took over the old factory gutted it. The investment firm I partnered with went under. I'm in debt. They repossessed the car last month. I didn't say a word. I just watched him. I need work. He finally said, "Any kind. I'm not asking for favors. I need a way back." I studied him. He wasn't lying. He wasn't putting on a show. He was exactly what we used to be, tired, raw, and scared. "There's a position open on night shift," I said. "Machining. You'll report to Carlos." He blinked. "Carlos, he's still here. He's a partner now," I said. "He trains new hires." A long pause, then he nodded. "Okay." I handed him a standard employment packet. No shortcuts, no special treatment. Richard signed the forms, then stood up. Before he left, he turned to me and said, "I never saw what you were really doing. I thought you were just in the background." "I know," I said, quietly. He opened the door, then paused again. "Dad would be proud of this place." I didn't reply. Some wounds don't bleed anymore. They just stay there, quiet reminders of what we survived. That night, Carlos called me. "Your brother showed up," he said. "Didn't talk much, just went straight to work, asked questions, listened." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "How'd the crew take it?" I asked. Like any new guy, he'll earn his spot or he won't. And that was the point. This wasn't about punishment, it was about balance. Richard had once stood in the big office and ordered Carlos to clean out his locker without so much as a thank you. Now he was learning how to clean burrs off raw steel under Carlos's watch. There's a kind of justice in that, not loud, not cruel, just right. The next week I walked the shop floor like I always did. People waved. One handed me a muffin from the break room. Another asked if I'd take a look at a new jig design. At the far end of the floor, Richard was at his station, hunched over the press. He didn't see me and I didn't wave, but I watched for a moment longer than I needed to. And then I turned back toward the office boots echoing on the concrete, not because I was cold, but because I had somewhere to be and someone to lead. I never got an apology, not from my parents, not from Richard, and I stopped expecting one. They weren't cruel people, just fixed in their ways. Bound by old ideas of who leads, who supports, and who stays invisible. But here's what I've learned. You don't need someone else to name your worth. The people who stood with me, Carlos, Linda, Marvin, they never asked who was in charge. They followed action. They followed care. And in return, we built something better than any title or inheritance. We built something fair. When I walk into the factory now, it feels different. Not because the walls are painted, not because the machines are newer, but because I know this place no longer belongs to one name or one bloodline. It belongs to all of us. Every worker owns a piece. Every voice matters. Every decision has a room full of hands behind it. And maybe the greatest revenge isn't power, it's peace. Knowing I didn't have to become bitter to win. Knowing I didn't climb over anyone to prove I belonged. I just kept going. Quietly, steadily, honestly. Until one day the world looked up and saw me standing there. So if you're listening to this and you feel like no one sees what you do, if you've been dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, especially by the people closest to you, I want you to know you are not alone. Your worth isn't waiting at the end of someone else's approval, it's already in you. Sometimes you just have to build your own floor to stand on, and when you do, they'll hear the echo of your footsteps. louder than any words they ever said.